of men who understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that the most profitable thing you could ever do was convince a free person that freedom meant buying something. This is the story of how that happened, how a genuine human struggle for dignity was studied, mapped, and then quietly redirected. How the American family, black and white, though never in the same way and never with the same consequences, was restructured not by accident, not by the natural drift of culture, but by deliberate economic design. How two incomes became not a choice but a cage, how debt became the new chain, and how a country that once feared depopulation now faces it as a statistical certainty. To understand where we are, you have to go back to a man who understood human beings the way a locksmith understands a lock, not with affection, but with precision. Edward Bernays was born in Vienna in 1891, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He came to America carrying his uncle's ideas about the unconscious mind, and he spent the next 7 decades turning those ideas into the architecture of modern consumer culture. He called it public relations. He could have called it something else. He could have called it the systematic engineering of desire. Bernays believed, and he wrote this openly, in books that anyone can still purchase today, that the masses were irrational. That they could not be trusted to make decisions based on fact. That the proper role of the intelligent minority, his words, was to regiment the public mind the way a military officer regimented his troops. Not through force, through the invisible manipulation of opinion. His first great laboratory was the First World War. The Wilson administration hired him to sell the war to an American public that did not want it. He succeeded. When it was over, he took what he had learned and offered it to corporations. They paid very well. In 1929, Bernays was hired by the American Tobacco Company. Their problem was simple and expensive. Women did not smoke in public. It was considered unladylike. Half the potential market was locked behind a single social taboo, and that taboo was costing them money. Bernays did not run advertisements. He hired a group of socialites to march in the New York Easter Sunday parade, cigarettes in hand, and he called a press conference in advance and told the journalists that a group of women would be lighting what he called torches of freedom, a symbol of women's liberation from male oppression. The press covered it as a feminist story. Women across the country saw it. Cigarette sales among women climbed for decades. Lung cancer rates among women followed. Nobody told those women they were being used. That was the point. What Bernays had discovered, and what every major corporation in America would spend the next century refining, was that you could attach a product to a liberation narrative and sell them both at the same time. The woman believed she was claiming her independence. The tobacco company knew it was claiming her money. Both things were true, only one of them was the goal. But cigarettes were small, the real project was larger. To understand the real project, you have to understand what the American economy looked like in the early decades of the 20th century. It was a manufacturing economy of enormous and growing power, capable of producing far more goods than Americans were consuming. The industrialists had a problem that was the mirror image of their ambition. They could make it, but they couldn't sell it, at least not at the volume and velocity the capital structure required. The solution, which emerged slowly and then all at once, was credit. And the re-engineering of what it meant to want things. Before the 1920s, most Americans, and this was true across racial lines, though the specifics differed enormously, operated on a basic principle that debt was a moral failure. You saved. You bought when you had the money. You did not purchase what you could not afford. This was not merely a personal ethic. It was a social consensus, reinforced by churches, by extended family networks, by the basic structure of community life in which your neighbors knew your business and your business included your finances. The consumer revolution of the 1920s was, at its core, an assault on that ethic. Not a frontal assault. Bernays had taught them better than that. A flanking movement, a reframing. Thrift became old-fashioned, desire became democratic, having things became the outward sign of American freedom, and not having things became, quietly but persistently, a kind of failure. Department stores hired psychologists. Advertising agencies opened research divisions. Window displays were engineered using principles drawn from the study of visual attention and emotional arousal. Women, who were understood even then to make the majority of household purchasing decisions, were the primary target. This was not accidental. Women's purchasing power, and the possibility of dramatically expanding it, was one of the central preoccupations of the American business class in the first half of the 20th century. And that preoccupation intensified dramatically after August 18, 1920, the day the 19th Amendment was ratified and women gained the right to vote. The suffrage movement had been long, painful, and genuinely heroic. Women had organized, marched, been arrested, gone on hunger strikes, been force-fed in prison, and fought for decades against a political establishment that could not imagine sharing power with them. The women who built that movement were serious, disciplined, and largely motivated by a vision of civic and moral reform. Many of them were deeply suspicious of consumer culture. Many of them were temperance advocates. Many of them believed that women's political participation would make public life cleaner, more ethical, more oriented toward human welfare. What happened instead was more complicated. The ratification of the 19th Amendment did not go unnoticed in corporate boardrooms. Neither did the movements that followed. The push for economic equality, for equal pay, for women's right to open bank accounts, to sign contracts, to enter professions that had been closed to them. These were legitimate grievances built on real injustice. The injustice was real. What is also true, and this is the part that tends to go unmentioned, is that the resolution of those injustices created something that powerful economic interests had been wanting for a very long time. A second adult in every household who could be taxed, who could be marketed to, who could be induced to borrow, and whose labor would compete with male labor and thereby suppress wages for everyone. The double-income household, which we now experience as a simple fact of economic life, was not an inevitability. It was a construction, and the construction required two things working in parallel. First, the political and legal dismantling of the barriers that kept women out of the workforce and out of financial life, and second, the inflation of the cost of living to a point where one income was no longer sufficient. Those two processes fed each other. They still do. But before we go further into the economic machinery, we have to be precise about something. Because the experience of black families in America during this period was not the same as the experience of white families. It was never the same. And to collapse them into a single story would be to repeat one of the oldest intellectual mistakes in American life. Black women in America had always worked. Not by choice in the way that phrase is sometimes used, as though it were a lifestyle preference, but by necessity, by compulsion, by the structural violence of a society that extracted labor from black people and then penalized them for the poverty that extraction created. Long before any suffrage amendment, long before any equal rights legislation, black women were in the fields, in the kitchens of white households, in the laundries, in every form of labor that white society needed done but did not want to pay for or acknowledge. The myth of the stay-at-home mother, the domestic ideal that advertisers would spend billions of dollars selling back to American women as an aspiration, was a white myth. It was always a white myth. For black families, it was not a memory or a tradition to be dismantled. It was a status that had never been available. This matters for the story we are telling because the economic restructuring of the American family in the 20th century hit black and white families differently, in sequence, and with compounding effects that we are still living through. For white families, particularly the working class and lower middle class white families that formed the backbone of the post-war consumer economy, the transition to the dual-income household was experienced, at least initially, as expansion. The second income meant a new car, a bigger house, a vacation, things that advertising had spent 30 years teaching people to want. The fact that prices would rise to absorb that income, that the housing market, the education market, the healthcare market would all reprice themselves around the assumption of dual income, was not immediately visible. It never is, in the moment. You see the new car. You don't see the mortgage that will take both salaries to service for 30 years. For black families, the story was different and in some ways more brutal, because the forces that attacked the black family structure did so not only through economic pressure but through deliberate policy. The welfare structures of the mid-20th century, particularly the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, were designed in ways that penalized the presence of an employed male in the household. If a man was present and working, the benefits were reduced or eliminated. The rational response, from a purely economic standpoint, was the absence of the father. And over decades, that rational response became a demographic pattern, and that demographic pattern became a cultural narrative, and that cultural narrative was then used to justify the very deprivation that had produced it. This was not an accident either. It is worth pausing here to say something clearly, because the argument we are tracing is one that is often weaponized in bad faith, and it deserves to be handled with precision. The critique of how the American family was economically dismantled is not an argument for the oppression of women. The women who marched for suffrage were right. The women who fought for equal pay were right. The injustices they were fighting were real. What is also true, and these truths are not in contradiction, is that powerful interests observed those struggles and saw in them an opportunity. Saw in them a way to expand the labor supply, suppress wages, expand the tax base, and grow the consumer market. The movement was genuine. The co-optation was also genuine. Both things happened. The question is not whether women should have rights. The question is, who profited from the specific path that the expansion of those rights took, and what did that profit require? The Equal Rights Amendment, first introduced in Congress in 1923 by suffragist Alice Paul, represents one answer to that question. Paul and her allies believed that formal legal equality, a constitutional guarantee that rights could not be denied on the basis of sex, was the only way to make women's liberation real and permanent. They were opposed, for decades, by a coalition that included labor unions, which feared the era would eliminate protective legislation for women workers, and social conservatives, who feared it would dissolve the legal structures that defined women's domestic role. What often goes unremarked is the financial architecture behind the era's eventual resurgence in the late 1960s and 1970s. The women's liberation movement of that era was a genuine mass movement with genuine grievances. The limitations on women's professional opportunities were real. The violence of domestic life for many women was real. The economic dependency that left women trapped in harmful situations was real. All of that is true. It is also true that the movement received significant financial and institutional support from precisely the foundations, corporations, and political actors who stood to benefit from the full integration of women into the formal wage economy. The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, various other philanthropic entities connected to the largest concentrations of capital in American history. These institutions understood something that the activists they were funding did not always fully see: that the liberation of women from domestic life was, from a pure capital standpoint, enormously valuable. It doubled the labor supply. It created an entirely new class of consumers with independent credit. It transferred childcare from the family, where it was free, to the market, where it could be charged for. It transferred food preparation from the home kitchen, where it was nearly free, to the restaurant industry and the packaged food industry and the fast food industry, where enormous margins were possible. It transferred elder care from the extended family to the nursing home industry. Every function that the family had once performed for itself, at no monetary cost, became, as the family dissolved, a service that could be sold. This is one of the most important economic transitions of the 20th century, and it is almost never described in these terms. The economist who comes closest to naming it clearly is perhaps not an economist at all, but the observation appears across multiple disciplines. When a mother stays home and raises her children, that labor does not appear in the gross domestic product. When she puts those children in daycare and goes to work, both her wage and the daycare fee appear in the GDP. The economy has, by the conventional measure, grown. But what has actually happened is that a transaction that was previously internal to the family has been externalized and monetized. Nothing new has been created. A relationship has been replaced by a service. And the service costs money that now must be earned. The infrastructure for that externalization was not built spontaneously. It was built by industry. Consider the transformation of food. In the 1950s, the average American household spent a significant portion of its time on food preparation. Meals were cooked from raw ingredients, largely by women, largely at home. This was not a golden age. The labor was often exhausting, the role often isolated, the lack of acknowledgement often crushing. But the food itself was real. It was nutritious. It was economical, and it happened inside the family. The processed food industry, which grew alongside and because of the transformation of women's domestic role, offered liberation from that labor and extracted an enormous price for it. The convenience food revolution, powered by chemists and food scientists and marketers, replaced home cooking with packaged products at significant caloric and nutritional cost, and at a financial cost that, multiplied across a family's food budget over years, was substantial. General Mills and Kraft and the companies that followed them were not offering freedom. They were offering a transaction: surrender the kitchen, and pay us for the privilege. Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in 1963. It is one of the most influential books in American history, and it named something real: the suffocation of intelligent, capable women within a domestic role that was too small for them, enforced by a culture that could not imagine women as anything other than wives and mothers. The book resonated because the experience it described was real and widespread. What is less discussed is that Frieden, a sophisticated intellectual with a background in labor journalism, was also operating within a cultural ecosystem that was being deliberately shaped. The magazines she criticized for their domestic idealization, the women's magazines that told every woman she could find complete fulfillment in a cleaner floor and a better casserole, those same magazines were, within a decade, running a different set of advertisements to a different version of the same woman. The ads now showed women in offices, in cars, in boardrooms. The message had changed, the monetization had not. The product being sold had shifted from the domestic woman to the professional woman, but the selling had not stopped. It never stopped. The credit card, which became mass market in the 1960s and 1970s, was not invented to help people. It was invented to generate interest income from people who would spend slightly more than they could pay back. The mathematics of compound interest on revolving balances is one of the most reliable wealth transfer mechanisms ever designed. Money flows, slowly and steadily, from the people carrying balances to the people who issued the cards. The people carrying balances are, disproportionately, working in middle-class families who are using credit to cover the gap between what they earn and what the cost of a modern American life requires. And the cost of a modern American life keeps rising. This is not an accident either. The housing market in America has been systematically structured to ensure that housing, the most basic need any family has, absorbs an ever larger share of household income. The combination of restrictive zoning, which limits supply in desirable areas, the mortgage interest deduction, which inflates demand, and the securitization of mortgage debt, which creates financial incentives for ever larger loan volumes, has produced a housing market that functions primarily as a wealth extraction mechanism for those who already own property and a debt incubator for those trying to acquire it. A family buying a median-priced home in a major American city today will, over the life of a 30-year mortgage, pay back nearly twice the purchase price in principal and interest. They will spend decades of their working lives servicing that debt. They will make that payment before they save, before they invest, often before they eat. The home they are buying is frequently not a significant appreciating asset in real terms, after accounting for taxes, maintenance, insurance, and the opportunity cost of the down payment. Home ownership has historically produced modest real returns for most buyers. What it has reliably produced is a payment stream, for 30 years, to the financial institutions that hold the paper. This is not freedom. This is a different kind of obligation than the one it replaced. Consumerism did not happen to the American family. It was delivered, door to door, first by salesmen, then by catalogs, then by television, then by the internet and the smartphone. At each stage, the delivery mechanism was more intimate, more personalized, more invisible. The television that entered the American living room in the 1950s was understood immediately by advertisers as the most powerful tool for preference formation that had ever existed. It was in the home. It was trusted. It mimicked the voice and presence of a friend. And it ran, hour after hour, an unbroken argument for wanting things. The programming that surrounded the advertising was not separate from it. This has been documented extensively and was understood by the people producing it. The situation comedies of the 1950s and 1960s that depicted white suburban families, Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, The Donna Reed Show, were not just entertainment. They were aspiration manufacturing. They showed a life that required a house in a specific kind of neighborhood, specific kinds of appliances, specific kinds of clothing and cars and social arrangements. The viewers who watched those shows were being shown what normal looked like, what desirable looked like, and the distance between what they had and what the screen showed them was the space that advertising promised to close. For Black American families, the relationship to that television mirror was different and damaging in its own specific way. The faces on the screen were not their faces. The lives depicted were not their lives and were not available to them, not in the same way, not with the same accessibility. The aspiration was being sold to them too. The same products, the same promises, but the structural barriers to achieving the depicted lifestyle were categorically higher. Redlining kept Black families out of the neighborhoods where property was appreciating. Discriminatory lending kept them out of the credit markets on equal terms. Employment discrimination kept their wages lower. The consumption was available, the debt instrument was available, often at worse terms, but the wealth-building infrastructure that would have made the consumption sustainable was not. The result was a particular kind of trap. The cultural messaging of consumerism applied pressure toward a lifestyle. The structural barriers prevented the wealth accumulation that would support that lifestyle without debt. The debt was available and eagerly offered. and the debt accumulated, with compound interest, and was passed along not as inheritance but as burden. There is a reason that the racial wealth gap in America has not only persisted but in many periods widened even as formal legal barriers fell. The removal of formal barriers was real and necessary. What was not removed were the structural economic relationships that continued to extract wealth from black households and concentrate it in white ones. Those relationships operated through the market. They did not require law. They required only that the market continue to function as designed, and that the design continue to reflect who had built it and for whose benefit. We must talk now about children. Because everything we have described, the dual-income household, the debt load, the consumer lifestyle, the dissolution of extended family networks, landed on the children. It always lands on the children. The industrialization of childcare is one of the least discussed and most consequential developments of the late 20th century. As mothers entered the workforce in greater numbers, not because they were lazy or irresponsible, but because the economic structure increasingly required it, and because the professional and intellectual possibilities now open to them were genuinely desirable, children moved from homes into institutions. Daycare centers, after-school programs, a cascade of structured activities and professional supervision that replaced, partially and imperfectly, what the family had once provided for free. The research on early childhood attachment, on the developmental importance of consistent caregiving relationships, on the specific ways that institutional care differs from familial care, that research existed. It was understood. It was discussed in academic journals. It was not discussed in the places where policy was made or culture was shaped, because the conclusion it pointed toward was inconvenient for the economic interests that were now deeply invested in the dual-income household as the structural norm. This is not to say that every child in daycare is damaged. The research does not say that. It is to say that the collective decision to restructure childhood in this way, to move the primary locus of early child development from the family to the market, was made without full accounting of its costs, and that the interests that benefited from that restructuring had strong reasons to minimize those costs in public discourse. The result, across several decades, is visible in public health data, in educational outcomes, in mental health statistics among children and adolescents, in rates of anxiety and depression among young people that have no historical precedent. The causes of those trends are multiple and genuinely contested among researchers. What is not contested is the trend itself. A society that is raising its children in a condition of increasing instability, decreasing family cohesion, decreasing economic security, and increasing institutional rather than relational care is a society that is drawing down on its human capital. The bill comes due slowly, but it comes due. The birth rate is the clearest signal. The United States, along with most of the developed world, now has a fertility rate below the replacement level of approximately 2.1 children per woman. The current rate in the United States is approximately 1.6 to 1.7 and declining. Below replacement fertility, held over time, produces population decline. And population decline, in an economy structured around growth and intergenerational wealth transfer, produces a cascade of consequences that the architects of the consumer economy did not model, or chose not to. The reasons for declining fertility are genuinely complex. They involve the cost of housing, which makes family formation economically daunting for people in their 20s and 30s. They involve the cost of childcare, which in many metropolitan areas equals or exceeds a full-time salary at median wages. They involve the cost of education, which has become a debt instrument as significant as a mortgage. They involve the career structures of the modern economy, which were designed around workers who had no domestic obligations, designed, that is, around an idealized male worker who had a wife at home managing everything the labor market did not see, and which have never been fully restructured to accommodate the reality of workers who are also parents. They also involve something harder to quantify: the erosion of the cultural consensus around family formation as a primary life goal. When a society spends decades teaching its members that fulfillment comes through consumption, through professional achievement, through individual experience and self-expression, it should not be surprised when those members defer family formation or abandon it entirely. The values embedded in the consumer culture, novelty, autonomy, self-optimization, the perpetual deferral of commitment in favor of options, are not family formation values. They are consumption values, and they were installed deliberately, by people who profited from them. The demographic consequences are now arithmetically visible. Fewer children means fewer future workers. Fewer workers means less production and less consumption and less tax revenue. Less tax revenue means pressure on the social insurance systems, Social Security, Medicare, that were designed around population growth assumptions that no longer hold. The solution that has been offered, immigration, is a genuine solution in some respects and a different set of problems in others, and it does not address the underlying fertility question. The underlying fertility question is this: has the consumer economy, in its drive to monetize every aspect of human life, made family formation itself economically inaccessible and culturally unattractive? The data suggests the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, then the system has eaten its own foundation. Debt is the mechanism by which this becomes irreversible, or very nearly so. The average American household carries significant debt across multiple categories: mortgage, automobile, student loans, credit cards, medical debt. The aggregate national consumer debt figure is now measured in the trillions. The service on that debt, the monthly payments that must be made before any other economic decision is possible, occupies a structural position in household budgets that was once occupied by savings. A household that carries significant debt does not have freedom of choice in the meaningful sense. It has obligations. It must generate a certain cash flow every month or face consequences, credit damage, repossession, foreclosure, bankruptcy, that are severe and lasting. The two incomes that were once surplus are now necessary to service the debt that was accumulated in part because two incomes were available and the cost of living had risen to absorb them. The circle is closed. The exit is not visible. This is debt slavery in the functional sense, even if the legal mechanisms are different from historical chattel arrangements. The person in debt cannot walk away. They must work. They must generate income. They must participate in the system. Their labor is not their own in any practical sense. It belongs, first, to the creditors, and then, if anything remains, to themselves and their families. For Black American families, this condition is compounded by the historical specifics we have already traced. A community that was prevented for generations from accumulating wealth, that was systematically excluded from the homeownership and credit mechanisms that built the white middle class, enters the debt economy from a position of structural disadvantage. The predatory lending instruments that proliferated in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the subprime mortgages, the payday loan chains, the high-interest credit products targeted at people with limited credit history, did not discriminate by race in their formal paperwork. They discriminated by zip code, by credit score, by wealth history, and those proxies mapped closely onto race because race had determined wealth history. The 2008 financial crisis wiped out approximately half of Black household wealth in America. Not because Black families had behaved irrationally. Many of them had done exactly what they were told the path to stability required, which was to buy a home, but because the financial instruments they had been sold were designed to fail, and the communities where they lived were the communities where those instruments were concentrated, and when the failure came, it was their neighborhoods that lost value and their loans that were called. White households lost wealth too, significantly, but white households entered the crisis with more wealth, recovered faster, and were more concentrated in the assets that were supported by the Federal Reserve's subsequent intervention. The crisis redistributed wealth upward and, within that upward movement, redistributed it further from Black households to white ones. It was a clarifying event. We have been talking for some time now about systems and structures and forces, about advertising and credit and policy and propaganda. It is worth stepping back for a moment to say what we are actually talking about, which is people. Families, parents and children, grandparents and cousins, the small webs of obligation and affection that are the actual substance of human life. What was lost in this process, what is being lost, because the process is not finished, is not just economic security or demographic vitality, though those losses are real and consequential. What is being lost is something harder to put a number on. It is the density of relationship that family, at its best, provides. The sense of continuity across time, of belonging to something larger than the individual self, of obligation to people who did not choose you and whom you did not choose but to whom you are nonetheless bound. Consumer culture is individually addressed. It speaks always to the sovereign self, the self with preferences and aspirations and purchasing power. It does not know how to address a family, except as a demographic cluster to be sold to simultaneously. It does not know how to speak to the relationship between a grandmother and a grandchild, except to offer products that can substitute for the time they might have spent together. It does not understand that the most important things in human life are not scarce resources to be allocated efficiently but relationships to be inhabited and sustained. The dissolution of the family was profitable. It still is. The debt that replaced the family as the primary organizing structure of adult financial life is profitable. The goods and services that replaced the family's internal functions are profitable. The therapists and counselors and self-help authors and wellness entrepreneurs who address the psychological consequences of a life lived without deep relational roots, they are profitable too. There is no stage of the process at which someone is not making money. What cannot be monetized is what is being lost. The sociologist Robert Bellah, writing in the 1980s, described what he called the first language and the second language of American life. The first language was individualism, the language of rights, of personal fulfillment, of self-determination. The second language was the language of community, of covenant, of commitment to something larger than the self. He argued that Americans had always needed both languages, that the first language without the second produced a particular kind of loneliness that was specific to modern individualist cultures. 35 years after Bellah wrote those words, the loneliness epidemic is a public health designation. It is measurable in the way that blood pressure is measurable. Americans report fewer close friends, fewer community connections, less sense of belonging than any comparable previous survey showed. The health consequences of chronic loneliness are documented as comparable to the health consequences of smoking, which brings us back, nearly, to Edward Bernays on the Easter parade, and the long trail of choices that were made for us while we were told we were choosing for ourselves. There are demographers who look at the current fertility data, the current debt data, the current household formation data, the current mental health data among young people, and who describe what they see as a civilizational transition. Not collapse. That word implies speed and drama that may not characterize what is actually happening, which is more like a very slow, very expensive, very profitable unwinding. But transition, a movement from one kind of society to another, driven not by any collective decision but by the accumulated weight of millions of individual choices that were shaped, at every point, by interests that were not the chooser's interests. The population of the United States is now expected, by the middle of this century, to begin declining absent immigration. Other developed nations, Japan, South Korea, most of Europe, are already in decline or approaching it. The nations with the highest fertility rates tend to be the nations where traditional family structures have proven most resistant to the full penetration of consumer culture. This correlation is noted in demographic literature. It is not considered a recommendation. What would a recommendation even look like? The process we have described is not reversible by any simple mechanism. The conditions that produced the dual income household, the inflation of housing costs, the cost of education, the debt load, cannot be dissolved by cultural exhortation. You cannot tell people to have more children and lower their debt simultaneously when the cost of raising children is one of the primary drivers of debt. You cannot tell women to return to domestic life when the mortgage requires 2 incomes. You cannot restore the extended family when the economic geography of the modern city scatters family members across thousands of miles in pursuit of employment. And you cannot undo what has been done to the human imagination by a century of consumer messaging. The vision of the good life that most Americans carry, the house, the car, the experiences, the consumption, was installed by people who profited from installing it. Uninstalling it is the work of a generation at minimum, and no one is funding that project with the resources that were used to install it. What you can do is see clearly. You can name what happened and how it happened and who profited from it and what it cost. You can refuse the comfortable story that says all of this was inevitable, that it was simply freedom expressing itself, that the market was just giving people what they wanted. People wanted what they were taught to want. They were taught by people with very clear financial interests in the lesson. The teaching was sophisticated and sustained, and it worked. It worked on white families, who were offered the aspiration first and most fully, who took on the debt and the consumption and the dissolution of the extended family and the single-family house in the suburb and the 2-car garage, and who are now discovering that the prosperity they built came at a cost that is still being calculated. It worked on black families, who were offered the aspiration and denied much of the infrastructure, who were sold the debt at worse terms and excluded from the wealth building, who paid twice, once for the exclusion and once for the predatory inclusion that followed. It worked on all the children who were raised in its logic, who learned that self-worth came from what you owned and that belonging came from what you could consume and that freedom meant the absence of obligation, who now find themselves in early adulthood with degrees that cost as much as houses and jobs that do not pay enough to service the debt and a profound uncertainty about whether any of the conventional markers of adult life, partner, home, children, are achievable or even desirable. This is where we are, not at the end of the story. Stories like this do not end, they transform, but at a legible point in it. A point where the arithmetic is clear enough that anyone who looks at it without the filter of official optimism can see what it implies. The American family, in all its forms, was the primary unit of human solidarity in this society. It was imperfect, often badly imperfect, often a site of harm as well as care. But it was real, it was durable, it generated things that cannot be generated any other way: continuity, obligation, unconditional belonging, the transmission of value and memory across generations. Those things are not gone. They persist in families that have managed, by some combination of effort and circumstance and deliberate resistance, to maintain coherence against the pressure. But they are rarer than they were. They are more expensive to maintain. They compete against a culture and an economy that do not value them and a political and financial establishment that has, for a century, systematically found ways to monetize their dissolution. What was done can be studied. What was done can be taught. What was done can, if enough people understand it clearly enough, be resisted. Not by returning to a past that was itself full of injustice, and not by pretending that the liberation movements that fought real oppression were themselves the problem, but by refusing to accept that the path those movements took was the only possible path, or that the interests that funded and shaped the specific direction of those movements were the movement's own interests. Freedom is real, the desire for it is real, the struggle for it is honorable, and the exploitation of that struggle by people who understood it better than the people living it, that too is real. It is one of the oldest stories in the history of power. And it is still being written.